Good evening to all of you. I'm Jim Wallace, and I am the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Chair in Faith and Justice and the founding director of the Center on Faith and Justice here at Georgetown University. I'm so pleased that so many of you could join us tonight for this important conversation. We are grateful for our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the National African American Clergy Network, led by my good friend, Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, and the National Council of Churches, led by one of our guests tonight, Bishop Vashti McKenzie. This month marks the 60th anniversary of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s arrest in Birmingham, Alabama. One of nearly 30 times he was jailed for coordinating protests, sit-ins, and other acts of civil disobedience. But this arrest, of course, was different. The Birmingham arrest occurred on April 12th, 1963. It was Good Friday, a fact that did not go unnoticed. He was arrested for protesting, which he described as a faith act against racism in the South's most segregated city. He was imprisoned alone in his cell, and King was given a copy of an open letter from 8 white ministers in Birmingham. The clergymen called him an outside agitator and urged him to end the protests, which they called unwise and untimely. But King disagreed, and his response to the ministers is one for the ages. His letter from Birmingham Jail was originally written on scraps of newspaper and toilet paper and smuggled from the jail by King's lawyers. After King's release, work continued on the letter. By the first week of May 1963, the final draft was completed and released to a select group of media, African American churches, and important supporters. Many have called his letter from Birmingham Jail the most important document of the civil rights era. We all know his speeches. Perhaps this was the most important single document of the civil rights movement. More than simply a response to certain ministers, King explains in no uncertain terms the justifications for civil disobedience and for the civil rights movement. As King famously said, he had almost reached the conclusion that the great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom was not the KKK, but was white moderates who were more devoted to order, he said, than to justice. It was not just a letter to the 8 white ministers of Birmingham, it was a letter to all faith leaders, really, and it is today, I think, too, who, as King said, quote, have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. I'll remember that one. This year, events marking the 60th anniversary of the letter were held in cities across the country, which speaks to the letter's enduring power. Our conversation here tonight is especially important because we are at a moment when a conservative movement is attempting to whitewash American history, to literally remove books and lessons from our children's schools. Here at the Georgetown Faith and Justice Center, we know that it is impossible to build a truly multiracial democracy if we do not wrestle honestly and directly with its legacy and current manifestations of white supremacy. At the moment, when some are trying to erase our history, especially our racial history, remembering and learning from the past is now more important than ever. So here we are, and we are very glad to be joined tonight by 2 of this country's preeminent Christian leaders who will help us do just that. We will examine Letter from Birmingham Jail and unpack its message for the Civil Rights Movement era and for our time. What does that letter mean now for us? We will look at together. Bishop Vashti McKenzie is interim president and general secretary of the National Council of Churches, where she leads a community of 37 member communions with 30 million Christians from Protestant, Anglican, Historic, African American, Orthodox, Evangelical, and Living Peace traditions. It's a broad spectrum. Bishop McKenzie was consecrated as the 117th bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in 2000, the first female elected to episcopal office in the more than 2-century-old AME Church. Bishop McKenzie has been active in social justice issues for more than 3 decades and was appointed in 2009 by President Barack Obama to serve on the advisory council of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, where I was grateful to serve alongside her. We are blessed to have Bishop McKenzie with us tonight and look forward to hearing her wisdom that she will share. Reverend Otis Moss III is senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago, where he was recently named as one of the, get this right here, 12 most effective preachers in the English-speaking world. That's pretty cool, Otis. That's pretty cool. By Baylor University. Dr. Moss is a professor of homiletics at Mercer University's School of Theology, with civil rights advocacy in his DNA, I would say. Reverend Moss has built his ministry on community advancement and social justice activism, practicing and preaching a Black theology that unapologetically calls attention to the problems of mass incarceration, environmental justice, and economic inequality. Dr. Moss is the author of several books, including most recently, Dancing in the Darkness, Spiritual Lessons for Thriving in Turbulent Times, a book that I highly recommend. Bishop McKenzie and Dr. Moss, thank you both for being with us tonight. It's a delight to have you here. 2 housekeeping notes before we begin our conversation. There will be a time of Q&A following our discussion. To submit questions, please type them in the chat throughout the discussion, and we will select a few. Secondly, we will announce the winner of the raffle for this, the 1963 printed publication of MLK's letter at the beginning of the Q&A. We will announce who won this. It's actually quite remarkable. I'd love to have this myself, but I can't win the raffle. So I just want to start with both of you this conversation on a personal note and ask both of you, what has been your personal relationship with this letter? What is your earliest memory of your engagement with it? What did you think then? How has it impacted you? And how does it continue to impact you now? Bishop McKenzie, let's start with you.
Jim, thank you so much for convening this opportunity to talk about the letter from the Birmingham Jail, and just as excited to be in conversation and dialogue with a good brother and friend, Otis Moss III. And so thank you for bringing this conversation to the forefront of the 21st century. When the letter, when King was in prison in Birmingham Jail, you have to understand that I grew up in a very social justice, social conscious family. My family, owned the Afro-American newspaper, which has been around for 130 some years. And so activism was a part of what we do every day. It wasn't something that you just go out and find or have nothing else better to do. We were involved from the earliest age, from 3 years old, at 5 years old, where we're going to the playground. This playground, colored children were not allowed to play on, but today you are, and over and over again. So I was in high school, graduating senior in May 1963. Don't you dare do the math. In May 1963. And I remember sitting in the basement of our home. It was dark and the television was on. You remember, in those days, television was a piece of furniture, right? Right. Otis would know none of this, but at that time, television was a piece of furniture. And so now we're watching, and my father was watching, and the film clips of the hoses and the dogs and all of that were turned loose on people who were protesting nonviolently. You have to understand, my dad was 200 pounds, 6'4", former college athlete, big, strong guy. And, I looked over and I saw tears coming down from his eyes. And he just looked at me and he said, "Never let anyone have to ask you what you did for your people. Period." In the discussion. And from that moment, I sensed the African diaspora calling. Not that I asked for the African diaspora to call, but there's something that compels you into this work. And so I heard the quotes from the letter before I actually read the letter. And so the quotes started in that summer. Justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I kept hearing the quotes. We are interconnected mutually. All these quotes were popping, but did not know where it came from until I read it. And we were compelled to read it in an African-American history class at Morgan State University. And that's where I read the class. So for anybody who says that African-American history doesn't, whoa, African-American history class is where we first read it. And you have to understand that reading it and understanding find out the facts to prove your point that there is some injustice, and create an intense event where people have to stop and take a look at what they have refused to ignore. We were the generation that was shutting down universities all over the United States. So when Morgan State University shut down, we sitting in, nothing happening until they respond to us. And this was happening over and over again. So when you said, what kind of influence did this letter have on us? We, discovered King's roadmap to change. This is a roadmap, and you can go back and look at history to see that every other organization that was looking for social change followed the roadmap that he set out in the letter from the Birmingham Jail. So that was my first engagement. Its impact upon us is that, we were like shutting down schools and so forth. My older brother was going on bus rides through the South. He was, there was the college students were all involved. And what that was is it was a very fearful time, because he would leave the house and he would be going on these campaigns through the South. I remember having prayer in our parents' living room that God would protect him and take care of him. And not knowing if he's going to make it back alive and if he's going to make it back in one piece. Is he still going to be in his right mind? And would he be injured in such a way that he would really not be my brother anymore? So it was a fearful time when something had to be done. the African diaspora is calling you to do it. And King gives us a roadmap on how to begin that process of change. I hope I answered your question.
You did. I love how this letter broke right into your family, a family that was deeply involved in the struggle. It was a family letter. And then your class, it broke into your class. And I think it's a wonderful phrase. This was a roadmap. That really explains what this letter was. It wasn't just a response. It became more than that. It became a roadmap. So, Reverend Moss, same thing. On a personal note, you also, I said, you have a DNA of the civil rights movement. You have generational involvement. So, when did this first hit you? When did you hear about it, see it, and how did it impact you at that moment?
Well, first, I want to say thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation, along with my Bishop Vashti McKenzie. We are so grateful for her leadership and for your leadership, and of course, to be anywhere next to Georgetown. That's a whole nother story. I was a huge John Thompson fan, by the way, back in the day. So, go Hoyas all the time. So that was my favorite team, but I'm just very, very grateful. There were in my family, both of my parents were involved in the movement. My mother was office manager for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and my father was an organizer for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And much later, after I came along, and there was what I would call extra canonical material that my father had added to the biblical canon. We always knew that, of course, there was the Bible, but there was extra material. Let me give you the extra material that was considered to be sacrosanct within our household. Jesus and the Disinherited was one piece. So Howard Thurman had to be included. Frederick Douglass's July 4th speech was another piece, along with the story of Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech. And then there was the letter from a Birmingham jail. And he would always communicate about this epistle. He said, this is an epistle. He said, you can read Paul's epistles, but you have to also understand King's epistle. And so from the pulpit and from the dinner table, my parents would have this conversation. The conversation about this work and the brilliance of what Dr. King did, who was able to merge African-American cultural history, perspective, and theology, weave together Martin Buber and Saint Augustine, put in a little bit of Socrates, lay out some moral philosophy, and then throw a wink, a shade, and you need to get right for those who were the moderate liberals at the time who thought he was moving too fast. He was saying that it was one of the most brilliant pieces that not many ministers, not many people, period, could weave together what he was able to do in a jail cell with toilet paper and a newspaper. He had no iPad, and didn't have a laptop. He was able to put together probably one of the greatest civic pieces of communication America has ever witnessed, and still resonates today. So I would hear the story of the letter, the people who smuggled it out. I would hear the story of when they first read it. I was hearing these stories and they would seep into me, but I didn't study it, just as Bishop had also mentioned, until I was at Morehouse College. Dean Lawrence Carter, who is the dean of the Martin Luther King Jr. Chapel at Morehouse College. It was a requirement that you had to study this letter and understand the depth of Dr. King's intellect. That, and as Dean Carter would say, he said that it is your responsibility. If you choose to go into ministry, this is the model in terms of that you must not only have this burning to preach, you must have intellectual depth to be able to communicate the issues of the time. And that was my introduction fully, was at the dinner table, hearing my father preach it from the pulpit, and then being faced with the letter as an academic piece of creativity from one of the greatest prophets and thinkers in the 20th century.
So this roadmap, as Bishop McKenzie called it, was also extra canonical epistle. I love that, in your house. And you both went at it in college. You both went in to study it in college. So let's dig into the content of this letter, which still resonates to today. So Otis, let me start with you this time. What are the central main messages of the letter that you remember, that stand out to you, always have? And from your vantage point right now, as a Christian leader today, why is this letter still so relevant?
Well, the one that resonates me was minister to ministers. What was this communication? So the remnant, the prophetic remnant, communicating to the wider ministerial community. In other words, the prophet communicating to the priest, and pushing the priest to become prophets, because you can be a priest and prophet, and prophets can be priests, but not all priests are prophets and not all prophets are priests. But that communication of a community that was that thought it had moral agency, but didn't have a moral leg to stand on, saying, why are you doing this? How dare you break laws? And which laws do you decide that you want to break? And then here comes Dr. King throwing back at them St. Augustine. And please know, he throws back an African theologian at them, which is so brilliant in one way, that Augustine says that that an unjust law is not a law at all. And we would today say Dr. King knew how to throw some shade and get you straight at the same time. It's just such a smooth and brilliant communication. And what's so important about it today is you still have people who have ecclesiastical positions but have no moral authority, and who are trying to claim moral authority. He was talking to the Christian nationalists of his day, and setting them straight and saying, you have no moral authority because your authority that you think you have is wrapped up in a Constantinian view of Christianity, of empire. And I want to correct that.
So it was really countering the Christian nationalists of his day. I love that. That's as relevant as could possibly be. The best way to confront bad religion is with religion that's true. So he was taking true religion, and indeed it was an Augustine, it was an African bishop, and Bishop Vashti, when she became Bishop of AME, she went to Africa for her stint in much the same way. So Bishop McKenzie, what main messages stand out for you from the letter, and how are they really relevant right now?
Well, there are many, Jim, but one particular part that stands out is that the oppressor does not voluntarily give up its power. And so then really it falls upon the shoulders of the oppressed to instigate change. There have been times in my life when I thought it was unfair. Why is it the beat down people? Why is those who are hurting the most? Why are those who are always on the outside looking in, Why is it that burden is placed upon our shoulders to be able to speak up and confront and adjust? So it is that to me is a call to action, is a call to change. You just cannot sit idly by. You remember, we were a part of the Brown versus the Board of Education crowd. And so, all deliberate speed was about the speed of a snail. And so unless you push that envelope, it's just not going to happen. And this change theory, the change theory really is biblically based. Jesus used the same kind of change methodology in confronting the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the doubters. He used carefully crafted words, creating images in the mind and stories that explain complicated theological process. So all Jesus had to say was seed, faith, net, kingdom of God. And it kind of explains everything. And so here comes King using language, simple language that just opens the mind. Power does not submit itself voluntarily. You are really going to have to stand up and confront this process. You're really going to have to speak up. You cannot just lay down and wait for change to happen. King also talked about in this roadmap, I call it a roadmap, a blueprint, if you will, the call to civil disobedience, which was really just so uncharacteristic when all the time, all of us, I'm talking about all of us, Black people and allies, were calling for people to follow the law, follow Brown versus the Board of Education, do this, do that. But King says, wait, there's a difference between just and unjust laws. And when the majority forces a minority to obey something or to do something by law, that which it will not do itself, you are permanently creating an underclass and then falsely giving the impression of privilege to another. And so I agree with Dr. Moss. King was confronting the white Christian nationalist of his day. Mm-hmm. And he did it masterfully.
And as you point out, there was those who criticized him, the clergymen, were kind of saying, stay within the law, stay within the system, fight behind the scenes, do more legal cases. But going to the streets was their problem, the way he brought these issues to the streets. And you're saying this letter, which from the beginning made its way to both your families and to both your colleges, this letter went beyond Birmingham pretty quickly. And today, we're still talking about it as the blueprint, as the epistle. And it really, as you say, there's a theology and a theory of change here. Theology and a theory of change. So in the letter, one thing that I've always really been struck by is how King contrasts the white church of his day with the earliest followers of Jesus. He makes that stark contrast. He writes, in those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and the principles of popular opinion. It was the thermostat, contrasting thermometers and thermostats that transformed the mores of society. Wherever the early Christians entered a town, the power structure got disturbed. And here was King now disturbing the power structure of Birmingham in the same way. So comment, both of you, on this powerful contrast. Thermometers and thermostats. We often, Romans says, don't be conformed to the world, transformed by the renewal of your mind, which is don't be a thermometer. be a thermostat. So that contrast was very strong throughout this letter here. Both of you comment on that, either one first.
Well, since I was last, I guess I'll go first this time, and then you can be, you can bet cleanup. See here, we were talking about how Jesus uses these words, and I think every preacher in the world has preached at one time the difference between thermometer and thermostat. But with Jesus and King, there is a barometer about discerning the times. And where Jesus confronted his critics and says, you can tell about the changes of the weather, but you cannot discern the times. And so for me, where are the sons and daughters of Issachar? Where are the sons and daughters of Issachar to discern the times now, to understand that the time of waiting is over? We have been in the incubator of justice for a very long time. And we've been waiting for our unalienable rights, and they haven't yet. It haven't yet been given. So when we talk about the change theory, the thermometer, the barometer, I think when King talks about when people talk about him being, no, he said it. I'm a drum major for justice. When he says it, that's another set of those words that says we cannot sit on the sidelines and wait for someone to hand what was granted to us by God, Imago Dei, what has been granted us by God, to just come into our laps. It's just not going to happen. We're the ones that's going to have to push the envelope to instigate the intense event that makes America take a look at itself.
So, Reverend Moss, have you preached the thermometer thermostat sermon?
Well, I've used it as an illustration, without a doubt. Without a doubt, Bishop is absolutely right that some. I heard it growing up. I heard preachers from rural areas say that there's a thermometer, and they go into the whole thing about the thermometer, and it's like, it just deals with what's going on outside. It goes up and down according to what is outside of it. But the thermostat controls the temperature, So yeah, I've heard that often. And the brilliance of King is he is disrupting the colonizing logic. So he's responding to these ministers who are saying, you know what, we don't like your demonstrations because the demonstrations, prior to the demonstrations, there are violence. And you are it precipitates your demonstrations. And he responds with such brilliant logic to say that is the same as if you are upset that a man gets robbed and his robbery is precipitated because he had something, and you said, well, he shouldn't have anything. And so he's walking through, and what we can't miss is a Black person at the height of a moment where you were not considered to be fully human, nor have the intellectual capacity to be able to joust with these ministers who had supposedly graduated from these wonderful universities. To have a man in jail with toilet paper tearing your logic apart is in itself, the act is like an intellectual bout of Muhammad Ali fighting someone who actually doesn't know anything about boxing. They think they do because, they got boxing gloves, but they've never been taught. And every step of the way, Dr. King completely destroys the logic of colonization.
When I hear you both speak to this, it strikes me the contrast between those who chart the winds, which we hear every day on the weather, who chart the winds. King was trying to change the wind. And every movement has to change the wind, not just chart it and see where it's blowing and record that, but change the way the wind's blowing. And the politicians, they have their finger up in the air and they see which way the winds are blowing. So when we're changing the wind, they notice that, and then they respond to that. Here's what King said about this difference in strategy. The things are different now, he said back in 1963. The contemporary church is so often a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. It is so often the arch supporter of the status quo. So each of you, what are some of the ways that you see the contemporary church supporting the status quo, being the thermometer instead of a thermostat, charting the wind and not changing the wind? And where do you see examples of it really beginning to be the thermostat and trying to really change the wind? Where do you see that happen?
When we consciously or unconsciously preach sermons that are complicit with the oppressor. When that happens, when we fail to examine the way we teach the Bible, we teach Sunday school, the way in what we preach, that's one way. Our churches, there was a time when our churches were the center of African American culture. Sunday school was where people learned how to read. And we may need to have Sunday school again, where we teach our history. You know, where we teach, we are the only people who entrust the education of our young to people who hate us, who don't like us, who never did for 4 centuries. And no matter who you are, what you do, you can be the president of the United States, but in the mind of the oppressor, you're still a boy that needs to jump when I say jump and do what I say do. You know, so when we are complicit in our preaching, when we fail to find the courage from somewhere, some people, yes, they're absolutely afraid. But what King did in the letter, he started out by talking about these are the facts. These are the reasons why I can see injustice in Birmingham. Homes were bombed and no one goes to find out. Violence has happened and there's no justice anywhere. So he gathered his facts. And so church after church, pastor after pastor, allow themselves to be threatened with their 501c3 without going to find out the information to know this is what you can do, even though you 501c3. Or we allow ourselves to be divided by an issue without understanding the reason why that issue is so important. We're not thinking about this issue. Oh, this is this issue. And it immediately divides us. And we cannot find a way in which we come back together so we can stand together. We tend to keep identifying the things that separate us rather than identify the things that can bring us together. And so the uncertain sound is the pragmatic voice of the prophetic house.
Moss, how do you see the church just conforming to the wind or changing the wind in our time?
I think that the church is conforming to the wind when it wraps itself in a pseudo theology that is more of an ideology, and it's masquerading in that manner, that creates trauma, destruction, and does nothing to alleviate the suffering of God's people. And I would use the example of how the pulpit has been used to destroy, undermine, hurt, and harm. And the doctrinal words Just pray on it. Stay with the, you've got, bruises around your neck. The kind of trauma that is put forth from the pulpit that is maintaining a type of destructive misogyny, that is maintaining a destructive racialized imagination, and then yells loudly about some particular issue, but is quiet around issues of suffering. And today you see it very clearly, if we may lift up a state, Florida, where you have legislature in Florida and in Tennessee and in other places that are attempting to quiet the voice of some of the most brilliant writers America has ever witnessed. Toni Morrison, can't read her. Maya Angelou, no more. James Baldwin is destructive. And the church, and when I speak of the church, I'm talking about the church that functions as empire. Speaking of the church that has joined hands with Pharaoh. When I speak of the church, I'm talking about that church. But on the other end, then there is the remnant. Just as a minister talking to ministers, there's a remnant of communities and people who are speaking prophetically, whether it is a Poor People's Campaign or Dream Defenders, or it is a state legislator in Tennessee who decides to quote Dr. King from the legislative floor, speaking about gun violence, that the voice of the prophet continues to echo. But prophets are never show up in mass. They're always a small remnant. And we should never assume that the church will be collectively prophetic. There will be a remnant, and hopefully that remnant, in the words of Nas, will get the mic, and the one mic can change the world.
I was thinking the other day about how where they're banning the books, and teachers are taking books off the shelf about Roberto Clemente and Jackie Robinson because they're afraid they'll be punished. Maybe churches in those places should set up whole big new libraries in our churches, and young people stream to our libraries after school to read those books that they're trying to keep from being read. You mentioned young people. Let me ask you a question here. We care about young people a lot. King said in that letter, quote, young people every day whose disappointment with the church has risen to outright disgust. He was meeting these young people. Now, all three of us have met those young people. Otis, when you were last here, Georgetown, my students all went to hear you and told me how wonderful you were. I told them I already knew. So are young people in your communities still looking for the church to be on the forefront of social justice, or have they given up on us? What do you think?
I don't think they've given up. I think that the Barna Group did a study. They said they love Jesus but can't stand the church.
Right.
And there is a generation, and that is a heck of a indictment. And at the same time, it is something beautiful and powerful. The fact that you still have people who are yearning for the church to be what the church is supposed to be. And that's really what's being said, because anger, frustration means I still got love for you. Indifference is the problem. And we have yet to move to the indifference mode. We have people that said, I want you to be what you're supposed to be. Because this man, Jesus, you all talk about, he's a liberating person. He's prophetic in his engagement. But all this other stuff, y'all keep talking about, Jesus is over here, but all the stuff you're doing is opposite. And so I think that you need to have young people of every generation who are critiquing institutions and people who find themselves in positions And I think that that's what's still happening today.
You and I were at a retreat with the Ferguson leaders way back at the beginning of the campaign, the Black Lives Matter campaign. I remember how you were so deeply moved by those young people. And I remember coming to visit your church a year later, and a lot of young people from the streets of Chicago in the Black Youth Project there, which is Black Lives Matter in Chicago, were at your church. And in the pastor study after the sermon, we had a discussion about the sermon. They were right there in your church. So they're showing up at your church.
They're showing up in different spaces, and
Yeah.
we're grateful that we're attempting to the best that we can do because of some of the leaders here creating a space without walls. And what's funny is they will say, you all are kind of peculiar and different at Trinity. We're talking about the mother folk, I mean, they say y'all are really peculiar, you all black. They call us the blackety black church. I mean, they joke about us. Bishop's laughing because she's here. And so they joke about us, but there's, the nicest thing I ever heard was a young man who said, "I'm never coming to your church." But then he looked at me, he said, "But you're my pastor. But you're not never coming to your church." He said, "I don't feel comfortable in church. I don't like you." He said, "But you better say something when I die. It'll be the funeral home but he said, you better say something." But there is that feeling. There is that real feeling. It's real. We got to really address it.
And maybe even more importantly, for them showing up in your spaces, you're showing up in their spaces. Mm-hmm. You're showing up where they are, in the streets, in the community. So when you're showing up where their spaces are, maybe or maybe not, they'll come to our spaces, but being in their spaces, which you're doing on the South Side of Chicago, I think is very important. Vashti, you're the head of the National Council of Churches, all these churches, millions of people. How are the churches who are in your wonderful network dealing with young people? How are we succeeding with young people today in those churches?
Well, let me share with you as I begin to answer that question. When you go back and look at the marches that were happening in the 60s, you will see that our allies at that time were members of the National Council of Churches.
Mm-hmm.
They have a huge sign, the National Council of Churches, in one of the marches. King came and visited with the National Council of Churches, and we do need to raise another generation of allies, because I go back and I quote Sweet Honey in the Rock, who sings a song that when the concern for Black mothers and their sons is the same as white mothers and their sons, we can't rest until freedom comes. So we do need allies, and I agree that we need to be in the spaces where young people are. We forget how young King was when he started the Montgomery bus boycott. He was a young man. And many of our young people don't see things the same way we see them. And so in our communions, they are many of our communities who have created innovative spaces for young people to have their voice, to be able to lead in this digital verse of ours. And so we want to give them opportunity. We have to begin the conversation where they're talking. And where they're talking and meeting is not in the traditional status quo spaces. And so many of our communions are going into the non-traditional places to have conversation. One of them is just where we are today. 600 people registered in the midst of a webinar. I don't know who they are. You don't know who they are. We may never meet them again. But we have begun a conversation. We have planted a seed. We are dialoguing, and they will grasp it, use it, and run with it in their own context. And so just as Jesus started with a story, I'll go to the woman at the well. She was coming for water. Jesus talked to her about water. Jesus didn't ask her to teach Bible study, didn't invite her to come to Sunday school, didn't invite her to Sunday service. He just started the conversation with water. And that's what we have to do. Start the conversation where they are and with what they have right now, and then lead them to where we want to be. We have to love folk. You know, you got kids who come to Trinity, come to Bethel, go to Ebenezer, you know, go to Mount Gilboa, you know, go to you know, St. Augustine, you know, go to the church. And baby boy walks in, they say, boy, you can't come here with your hat on. You know, pull your pants up. You know, come back when your skirt is a little bit lower, without understanding when baby boy walks in the door, it is not what he has on. It is not where they come from. Your conversation should be, we've been waiting for you. We've been praying for you. You didn't even know we've been praying for you. Come on, sit down next to me.
Yeah.
The hat, the clothes, and all of that is inconsequential. We're after your heart. We're after your soul. We want to make sure your mind is fed and nourished so that you can rise to your full potential. And that's why some young people have a hard time coming to church, because they stumble over us. They stumble over the human factor and can't get to Jesus Christ.
Well, Tennessee's already come up here, and let's talk for a moment about Tennessee. You had a new generation of Black legislators who quoted up King and talk about themselves as part of the third Reconstruction. You had young people who are turning out, some not even able to vote yet, they're too young. This movement about guns in Tennessee is multiracial, and lots of young kids were coming to it. And some of those legislators had seminary training. So Tennessee is gone across the country now. We've seen a new generation rising up, and we heard preaching on the floor of the Tennessee legislature, which gave me a lot of hope for what you're both talking about.
You know, it just blows my mind that children have the courage to do what grown folk haven't done. You know, when children have to speak up for their own rights, when children have to take to the street, because the grown folk are not saying anything at all. It just blows my mind. And I'll just leave the rest to Otis.
I think I say ditto on that one. I'd say ditto without a doubt.
Yeah, so it's not just in Tennessee. I think with the high school shooting in Florida, when the children started to take to the streets and demonstrate for their own safety and their own rights. I think it was in Chicago, actually, when a sixth grader wrote their last will and testament. A sixth grader should not be writing their last will or testament because they're not quite sure they're going to come home from school.
Right.
So that shows a failure of the grown folk doing grown things to stand up, that your children have to speak up for themselves. So I shared in another context, I said, it depends on how you grade America. If you grade America on her gross national product, if you grade America on income status and socioeconomic status, if you grade America on her military might, then she ranks among the greatest in the world. But if you grade America on her ability to protect her children, America has a failing grade. A failing grade that we can't figure out how to have gun safety, protect children, and still have a Second Amendment rights.
Right.
We haven't figured that out. And so too many, I think I was at your church, I just want to talk about too many tiny little coffins being lowered into the ground. Too many tiny little coffins being lowered into the ground.
And indeed, it was the Birmingham history, as powerful as the Birmingham letter was. that didn't win in Birmingham. It was the Children's Crusade, which happened about 2 weeks later. And I know people who were middle school kids and climbing out of the windows on ropes from their schools in Birmingham when their principals wouldn't let them go. They climbed out the window ropes. Now they're clergy, and one's a bishop I've talked to. They were the kids who climbed out the windows of their schools to go and march with Dr. King in the streets against Bull Connor and his violence. And the children doing that is what really brought the campaign to such national attention and was critical for its success. So when children climb out of their windows or they show up at legislatures, this is what's going to change the minds and hearts of a lot of people. A question about movement and strategy. The letter from Birmingham Jail talked about the external work that's necessary for nonviolent campaigns, but also noted the internal work that's necessary as well. He talks about 4 necessary steps for a nonviolent campaign: collection of facts, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. And I was struck by the explicit step of self-purification. What do you make of that? Was he speaking on individual level, group level? We talk about external. How do we prepare ourselves as a movement internally for the struggle ahead? What can we learn from what King was saying there about a movement's need for that deeper, that's Howard Thurman, that deeper contemplation, that deeper purification? What does that mean for us today, do you think?
I'm glad you brought that piece up. I remember as a child, my father and my mother talking about the steps that they had to take in reference to the movement. And they were always saying that there is a space for everyone. He said, not everybody is going to march. My mom, so I said, I'm not marching. I get mad too easy. So I'm gonna be doing some organizing at the office, so I get y'all out of jail. But he said the education aspect, that the collection of facts, that you have individuals who are specializing, the intellectuals, like here is the information. And then there's the negotiation. They said, we're going to sit down with the folks, even though we know what the answer is going to be. But there is a purpose to sitting down with your opponent when they tell you no. But we went through the steps. But then that self-purification is also one of the other terms that they would use was preparation, meaning that there's an individual preparation. My spirit, my body has to be prepared, and I have to be ready to go into enemy territory. I'm going to hear things, see things, feel things that I've never felt before. So am I ready to do this? And know that I'm going in as a witness, as a soldier, as a warrior for the transformation of democracy. And if I can't do it, then I need to get out. Now, it's interesting why they had self-purification there, because they knew that there was already a disruption COINTEL program. They didn't call it COINTEL then, but they knew that you could identify some of the people who were working on behalf of J. Edgar Hoover because they couldn't go through self-purification. So we could identify those who were trying to disrupt. I would hear from my parents because they would refuse this process and they were not prepared spiritually to move into the direct action moment. So there has to be a preparation for your act. The art of war, Sun Tzu talks about it. Martial arts talks about it. Muhammad Ali talked about it. He said, it's not just me moving my hands. He said, there is a spiritual preparation before I get in the ring. And there was a person who had a role for him for his success, Drew Houdini Brown. He said, you got to have the right cut man in the corner when you are bloodied up that can put you back in the ring. So the self-purification piece is critical but we want to jump over that and get directly to the action piece, but not, we've got to have the self-purification preparation.
Really important point. Now, all you out there could write those questions down in the chat. We're going to do a couple more here and then go right to you for your questions. So please send those along. Bishop. I
look at the steps as two different ways. One, it's boot camp. You know, if you are in the armed forces and you're going to have to serve your country, you're going to need to know your weapon, how to take it apart and put it together. You're going to need what weapons are at your disposal, whether it's a rifle, an AK-47, or it's a knife, or it's a side piece. But the last weapon you have is your hands. The steps are boot camps. What weapons do you have? Your nonviolent action. Prayer is a weapon. And at the end of the day, all you have is your faith. It's not hands to fight back. You have to go through boot camp to be mentally prepared to be able to take a blow. Everybody can't do that. I understand your mama. Everybody can't do that. Anger, being able to hit back. If you also understand that as the rise of the nonviolent movement, there was also the rise of the Black Power movement. Totally opposite, same goal, but opposite approaches. Then not only is the boot camp to prepare your body and mind to put yourself, to go into battle, put yourself on the bottom line, but the gathering of facts is your why. You can't go into battle unless you know what your why is. Your why will make you go. Your why will make you stay there. Your why will make you stare down the German Shepherd dog that's coming straight at you. That why will help you, protect, to protect your body when the hose goes on you. The why, when the paddy wagon shows up and a whole bunch of police officers jump in, and you know where you're going to go and you don't know what's going to happen. And you heard the testimonies, and some people, the violence in the jails and the fondling and the raping and all of that. Your why, say, why did you do that? I did this for these reasons. And those are the list of facts. So you have to go through boot camp. That's the preparation that Otis is talking about. But you also have to understand your why. And even though you feel you're all by yourself, the Lord will go with you.
Yeah.
You have a power that is not your own.
Well, your older brother, who you told us about, who rode the buses and the sit-ins, he probably went through that preparation. Our friend, brother Jim Lawson, did a lot of that at Fisk University and so many others. I think sometimes we don't do the preparation now that we need. It was done back then. So something for us to give thought to. I want to finish this section before questions with a quote that you raised, Bishop, in your opening remark, this famous quotation from King. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now, we've all used that again and again, but given the many injustices we see in our time, from gun control to climate to policing, mass incarceration, racial justice, how do we discern where and how to focus our energies? Mm-hmm. How do we discern where and how to focus our energies?
Me first? Okay. Where and how to focus our energies? Most of the time we respond. Mm-hmm. A crisis happens, a George Floyd happens, a Breonna Taylor happens, and we respond. And we respond in the moment, but we don't follow all the way through until we get a result. So we're in the street, we protest, we show our anger, and there's such a thing as trauma fatigue and collective trauma that we all share. But we don't always. We need to respond to it, but we can craft our own narrative. We can choose the issues. We can define the issues. We can share that issues with others, especially if we follow the thought. You're going to ban this book today. Then you're going to ban this video and ban this movie. If you're not careful, they're going to talk about banning the Bible. and taking out which sections of the Bible, because Jesus is an extremist. He's an other, and so we can craft our own narrative. We can select the things that are important for us and then push that envelope if we would just stand together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Reverend Moss?
Yeah, I would add that when our hearts are breaking and we're deeply passionate about a particular issue, going through the process of educating, going through the process of purifying, and joining the fight. Now, when we join the fight, that doesn't mean we are in the ring for every fight, but it does mean that we support those who are the fighters.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, for example, keep using Muhammad Ali, but I was like, Muhammad Ali was a heavyweight. He can't fight the featherweight fights. It's wrong. He can't do it, and he doesn't have the skill. He's too slow. He's just too slow because of his size. But he sits courtside and he helps support. So there is this thing that sometimes people think that they have to be involved in every single issue. You may not be involved in every single issue, but you can be supportive. You can be an accomplice in every single issue, though you may not necessarily be the one who's in the ring. And
Right.
we've got to learn how, for example, I think about the South African movement, that so many people were supportive, but we're not on the ground. And we've got to know when our place is to be supportive, but not on the ground, because there are other people who have a better view, have the plan, that we've got to get in line and say, where you say we go. And that's one of the big challenges today, that people want to show and then they all of a sudden want to take over.
Yeah.
You got to know that
sometimes
you got to sit your behind the back.
Yeah, right. And in a movement, the important thing is you have to know you're not alone, that other people are doing the same things you are in different places. And being alongside the ring is a powerful notion of being in the ring. Oh, okay. Before we transition to questions from our viewers, we have some business to handle. Here it is, the MLK publication. The winner of this historic 1963 publication of MLK's Letter from Birmingham Jail is none other than Reverend Dr. Lester A. McCorn of Clinton College in South Carolina.
It's rigged. It is rigged. It is rigged. It is rigged.
This is all Georgetown honest. So congratulations, Reverend McCorn. You're known here. A member of our staff here at the center will soon be in touch with you to arrange for this. It is historic document. Will get into your hands. And let me hasten to say thank you to all of the faith leaders and clergy persons who have connected to our work at the center. That clergy network's powerful for us. We'll be in touch with you very soon about more opportunities. Now, here we go.
Reverend Wallace, could I just say, Reverend McCorn, AME Zion, brother, graduate of Morehouse, he is president of Clinton College. He transformed the school from a 2-year institution to a 4-year institution. And it is So I just wanted people just to know what he is doing. It is absolutely incredible. I'm a huge fan of Dr. McCorn.
Well, this will be up then. Go ahead.
I echo that, and I just want to tell you, Doc, we coming to visit to see this book that you're going to get. Both of us are going to come and take a look at this edition. Before we leave the other subject, one of the things I just want to piggyback on what Otis was talking about. I liken what you're saying, that we all have to discover our own pulpit. Your pulpit may be in the church, yours may be in business, yours may be in education, yours may be in science and medicine, military. Know what your pulpit is, and then you preach from that pulpit. So in other words, that means I take personal responsibility to whatever part of the struggle where I am.
Yes.
I can effect change in education. I can effect change in medicine. I can affect change from the pulpit where God has me. Everybody can't march, but if you the marcher, you march. Everybody can't preach. If you the preacher, you preach. You might be the organizer. You have organizational gifts and skills. Use that to help in organizing the struggle. You just might be the, stuffing the envelope and licking the stamp person, but you do the best one. You might be the encourager, greatest encourager of the whole entire world, keeping everybody motivated and encouraged and on task and on focus. Whatever your gift and skill is, it can be used in the struggle. Just plug in where you are.
Now we know this historic document will be on the wall of the president at Clinton College. A wonderful thing for us to see. Here's a question, okay? In the letter, Dr. King observed the prison guards constantly walking past his cell, desiring to engage him in conversation. When the conversation started, Dr. King asked the guards what was their annual salary. When the guards shared with him their salary, Dr. King demonstrated why they should be out marching with him and the Black citizens. Please ask the panelists to talk about this piece, addressing the mindset of individuals, how we talk to people and bring them on board. Great question. Either.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. There's a great scholar named David Roediger who talks about the wages of whiteness. And he talked about whiteness being a wage when there was a time period known as the Bacon Rebellion, where Blacks and indentured servants got together and said, the real problem is the person who owns this land, who is the landowner. And Dr. King was using that same logic again to say that there's a small group of people who hold power in this state who do not want to see you, the prison guard, connected with domestics, and the domestics connected with people who are doing work in the trenches here in the city. And that's the kind of conversation that we need to have, that there's deep commonality. Stephen Biko talks about when the oppressed are liberated. Also, it liberates people who think they're the oppressor and the oppressor. And I think that Dr. King was working through that idea of building coalition and knowing that there is deep commonality and there is suffering that many people deal with, but because of the racialized imagination, they cannot see the connections. And he was trying to do that.
There are people in America who profit from our pain. And anytime that we stand up to try to change that, it impacts their economy. And so it is economically efficient for them to be sure that there is a permanent underclass who will work for whatever they can get, work however long they can get for whatever you're going to pay. So we forget the economic aspect of Dr. King's civil rights movement, that there was an economic component there. So when we hear what's happening in public education, the miseducation of the Negro, the miseducation of our children, you are ensuring that there will be an underclass of people who will work whatever they can get for whatever you give, how many hours, and can do that. So we start them out that way. And then, of course, the public education to prison pipeline, where prisoners work for pennies a day. So that's like free labor. And so that as long as they can profit from our pain, they're going to work overtime to keep you there. The second thing is that they fail to see that we're all tied together. We are all tied together. If we're talking about economic equity, it's going to profit that jail guard just as much as it's going to profit us.
Well, the economics of the movement has been rightly raised up. And when Dr. King was shot and killed, he was there for a campaign with sanitation workers. So Now, we have a multiracial audience, and I can tell from the questions. Here's one. In terms of our Christian communities acting more like thermostats than thermometers, what advice can you give predominantly white faith communities to trying to engage with racially diverse communities to enact moral and financial reparations for past and current racial injustices? Bishop McKenzie, you work with a lot of predominantly white congregations in the National Council of Churches. So what's your wisdom here?
I call them tables of transformation, that if we can get different people with different opinions, different backgrounds, different aspects to a table of transformation where we have honest civil dialogue about where we are. It begins the process. It's not the total process, but it just begins the process of helping other people to understand who you are, your history, your heritage, and the plight and your pain that you are facing. And that how individually we have a personal responsibility to plug into that. The other thing is, you can exchange pulpits. I remember as a pastor of Payne Memorial in Baltimore, we were having the community where my church was located was having miscommunication with Koreans who were coming in and owning mom and pop grocery stores. There was a difference of language, difference of attitude, not understanding. And so we partnered with a Korean church. We worship at their church. They came and worship at our church. We fixed food for them. They fixed food for us. We invited them for, Black History Month. They invited us for Korean Celebration Day. We were in traditional African dress. They were in traditional Korean dress. We found out that both of us eat pig feet, but we just prepare them in different ways. The kids were in teams. We won the basketball contest and we lost the ping pong contest. But in that exchange, our kids learned how to play together. They learned how to sing together. We learned different words in each other's language so that we became more familiar. If you want to do it, you can do it.
Yeah.
And the church is a great place to begin that conversation.
And Otis, I know you've learned in Chicago that it's not just exchanging with churches, but together being involved in the community together around concrete issues and struggles that face the community that can bring churches together across a lot of boundaries.
We've just witnessed this past Saturday, 1,000, majority, about 90% of them Black men from different churches in the city. We did a walk downtown, not against our children, but to say that we love them, that we want to see an expansion of the summer jobs program, that 5 churches, Trinity included, that we are offering up to 750 jobs to young people this summer. And we wanted to change the narrative, not a narrative of throw away our children, but a narrative of that they are ours and we want to embrace them. And it was because of you had this amazing coalition of people. People from different backgrounds. We had a lot of Pentecostals. Pentecostals were normally, they were like, we're in the world, not of the world. And so all these Pentecostals showed up. So we had some major tambourine, Holy Ghost dancing, speaking in tongues folk who were ready to say, like, we're down with this, along with some wonderful folks from the north side of Chicago who joined us, and synagogues who joined us. And they were saying that we're in this together. This is our city. And these are our children also, which was really beautiful to witness.
Right. I can tell people who are watching this are reading the letter themselves. And the language, one of the things that King was attacked for being was an extremist. He was an outsider, an extremist. And in the letter, the question says, Dr. King said the world needs creative extremists, and he called for extremists for love, extremists for love. What did he mean by that? And who do you see out there that are being extremists for love and justice in these days?
Wow. Well, Jesus is the ultimate extremist for
Mhm.
love, and I
Uh-huh.
think King quotes that in the letter. I think it sounds like the person who's asking the question is helping us to identify which things to be extreme in.
Yes.
Like when King advocated for civil disobedience, he was not advocating for lawlessness. He was not advocating for anarchy. And so if we're going to be extreme about something, then absolutely love is a good thing to be. There are several out there. Of course, Bishop Barber has been on the campaign trail for breaking down the barriers and repairing the breach out of that scripture in Isaiah. But they are nameless men and women in our communities who are absolutely working and serving examples of love, who don't have a major platform, whose names are never called, but
Right.
they're unsung heroes in our churches as well as in our communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. A lot of white folks don't know about what the hush harbors were, where slaves met secretly away from white people to practice the religion, to worship, to learn to read the Bible, and then read the Bible and talk about the book. And it's interesting to me, and you both know this internationally, that it was the hush harbors that led to the Black churches. And if you ask around the world, internationally, which of the American churches has impacted the world the most of any other church, the consensus answer would be the Black churches.
Mhm.
The Black churches. So here are the most impactful church, American church on the world, had its origins in hush harbors, where slaves were reading the book and fashioning their own religion. And what does that say about where the natural place and venue and community is for the church? From the edges, the margins, what Reverend Moss said about the anti-colonial church. So to me, that hush harbor history is so powerful for where we need to go now about the church of those on the outside. Finally was the church that is the church that has impacted the world the most.
What's interesting, I'm glad you brought that up, Reverend Wallace, is that humanity has been trying to make incredible cathedrals ever since, we had some tools to build anything. But the hush harbors were a part of a cathedral that no human being could ever create.
Yes.
Your pew
Yes.
was a stump. The sky was literally the ceiling. The pulpit was down by the riverside. I mean, there's just creation itself was the space in which not only you worshiped, but you recognized as sacred. And I'm a lover of architecture, but no piece of architecture can ever in any way compare to creation. And what does that do to your spirit? That when you say, you talk about the power of God, at the same time, you're standing under a tree that no human being could ever make. You talk about the power of God, and then saying you're right by the river and you can hear the waters of the river. And maybe there is a need in the midst of this whole climate moment. Maybe we need to return in a sacred way for moments and remember that our churches don't have cornerstones in them, but there are stones around the corner. we need to return to that, and maybe there would be a different way in which we would see our future for our young people.
Well, I love worshiping outside where the sky is your canopy, and under the trees, under the stars, under the sky. But perhaps maybe if we looked at it in another way, oppressed people always created their own language, that they understood themselves. And so to be able to steal away to Jesus, to be in a place where you could be yourself,
Yeah.
where you are seen by each other and seen by God,
Yeah.
who has already said to you that you are created in God's image, that you are so valuable that Jesus died for you, no matter what you went through that day, no matter how many times you were beaten or how oppressed or whatever thing happened to you, you come to the hush harbor where you get to see yourself as a reflection of God's eyes and not a reflection in a master's or a slave master's eyes, and realize your own humanity in Christ. It's sort of like to get yourself together. You know, in the hush harbor, there was no therapist or counselor you can go to, but testimony time.
Come on. Come on.
Yeah, right.
Testimony time. Let me tell you
Exactly.
how good God has been. Let me tell you what I went through. Let me tell you how I got there. You know, and it's a shame that we have let go of testimony time in our worship experiences, that we forget how powerful and how healing it can be just to be able to share your testimony, knowing that somebody else has that same testimony. It may not be in the same place where you are, but if they see that you got through, then they hope that you might get through too.
Yeah. The idea of banning the Bible has come up tonight. Fisk University, of course, has some of those old slaveholder Bibles that have been radically edited. The whole book of Exodus is taken out of those slaveholder Bibles. The Galatians text about all being one in Christ across race, gender, and class, they had to get rid of Galatians. So slaveholders were afraid of slaves learning to read because they might read the book and it might inspire them to their freedom. And so they're afraid of things when they ban things. They're afraid of particularly young people deciding to become the new abolitionists of our time. So let me finish with this question. Given this conversation, how do we move strongly forward to what Dr. King and so many saints have called the beloved community? How do we do that? It's your final word, both of you, in any order.
Well, you know, we are tied in a single garment of destiny. We are, and interconnected, interrelated, whether we like it or not. And if we don't learn how to live together, surely, the house of cards of democracy will fall down around our ears. When you have a garment, and the garment is constructed, and there is a thread that's weak, you don't pull the thread out, because it will loosen the other pieces of thread in that particular single garment of destiny. The wisest thing to do is to strengthen that thread. That's Galatians 6:1, and help that thread come back into the garment, so that our single garment of destiny is strong. We've got a shot at it every round. Each generation is never one and done, a shame, but each generation has an opportunity to strengthen that garment, so that all threads understand that they are valuable and that they belong, that they are accepted, and that they have a right to those unalienable rights, those just laws.
I might just quote something that I heard my father say at the Children's Defense Fund last year. And he couldn't be there physically. He was on Zoom, and a similar question was asked. And he said, as a person who is in the exit lane of life, he said, all one can do is do in your space, in your time, do good for the time that you have. And then the next generation will be called in their space, in their time, to do good with the resources that they have been given. And then, as the indigenous community would say, 7 generations from now, they will look back at the ancestors who used their space and time to do good. For every student who went to Morehouse, there's something that we all had to learn. And I'm giving a shout out to Dr. McCorn out there. We were put into the chapel. Dean Carter would come out, and just about everybody could quote this because it was told to us so many times. It would say that God places the crown above your head, that you will spend the rest of your life growing tall enough to wear. And then Dean would look at all of us and say, young men, I hope you'll be taller tomorrow. That's all we can do. Be taller tomorrow. Do in your space and in your time, do good and pass it on.
Yeah.
And when we are in the balcony of eternity,
right,
we can celebrate and lift up what our children's 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 children are doing.
Howard Thurman's been lifted up here already, but in his commentary on the parable of the Good Samaritan, he said the lines, dividing lines that civilizations draw, are mutually exclusive to the words of Jesus to bring us together for that community. We are a countercultural community. We'll always be that. And I think that kind of place can change the wind. And a new generation wants so much, I think, to be part of that beloved community. So I wish we're all in the same room, because if I said thank you to both these people, you'd all be standing and clapping in thankfulness to them. So wherever you are, jump out of your chair and clap your hands for these two, Bishop McKenzie and Reverend Moss. Thank you so much. I always love to hang out with the two of you, and I could talk to you all night, but 8 o'clock has come and we have to say goodbye for now. So blessings to the two of you in your wonderful work, and blessings to all of you who are listening in your wonderful work. And let's take this calling for our space and time, all our different spaces and times, to do what we're talking about tonight. And we thank you for a letter written a long time ago, which found its way into all of our hearts and minds and will continue to do so. So thank you all and bless you all. Amen.